Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hugh Dayton. I'm the organiser for REMS events, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our chairman, Mike Quinton, to talk about Robert Hooke. But before we do, just a little bit of advertising. You've obviously managed to get into this call through the IOP webinar site. We've got one of our annual at-homes coming up. Slightly different format this time. Instead of having an all-day event, we've got a sequence of 5 talks on successive weeks, starting on the 28th of January, and they're all about space science. So if you go to the IOP webinar site, you'll be able to see those talks coming up. I will send around a reminder to everybody in a week or so, so that you've got an up-to-date look at what's going on. So I hope you enjoy those. But now I'll hand over to Mike Quinton, who's going to tell us all about Robert Hooke, a man of mystery.
Right. I'm just going to try and... Right, I hope people can see my first slide.
Yes, we can.
Right. Jolly good. Right, well, good afternoon, everybody. I can't see anybody. All I can see is my own slide. Anyway, I hope you recognize me. We haven't met for a long, long time. Happy New Year. That's the first thing to say. So this is a talk about Robert Hooke, a practical scientist and architect who lived mostly in London and died over 300 years ago. I'm sure you all know about his law of elasticity. And here's a spring. By the way, this spring was in a drawing of his in a publication of 1676. The extension of a spring is proportional to the force applied. Now, I thought everybody knew about Hooke and his spring. That was until Monday, when I met somebody, and I just happened to say I was giving a talk on Thursday about Robert Hooke. And there was a short pause, and then this person said, "Oh, is he a pirate?" I had to explain he was not Captain Hooke. Anyway, here we are, man of mystery. The mysterious bit is we don't know what he actually looked like, or where he was buried, or where he was finally buried. But we do know what he did. And I'd rather hoped this talk would have taken place in the at 37 Caledonian Road. You can see in the picture. It's not the pub in the foreground, but the grey entrance over on the right is where you go in. If you haven't managed to go there yet, the IOP has been there for a little while now, but of course we haven't been there for a year, jolly nearly a year. And a year ago, we were in there, and here we are at the at-home in January last year. I'm trying to make this talk a little bit social, if you like. So here's a crowd picture. And then going back a bit to where we used to be in Portland Place. This is at number 80 Portland Place, in the Rosalind Franklin room. Here we are on the 9th of January 2014. Also at an at-home. Right, well, the talk is about Robert Hooke, who died in 1703. REMS went to Westminster Abbey. When did we go? In December 2013. We were on our way to the Institute of Civil Engineers for Christmas lunch. I should have taken this picture myself, but I didn't. And so I'm relying on a photo by a lady called Rita Greer. She's an artist, and we will meet her later. Now, what the social bit of this is reminding myself, and you possibly, I know you can't read that very well, but as an at-home on science in the late 17th century, and that was in January 2012. It was organized by George Freeman, standing on the right, And the chairman of the day, and it was a full day, was John Belling on the left. Now, Robert Hooke, and there are lots of books about him. So I've started at his death in 1703. We'll go back and use some of these books to find out a bit more about him. There's a number of books. Stephen Inwood, The Man Who Knew Too Much. That was the first one I read. Lisa Jardine, The Curious Life of Robert Hooke. And then actually on this meeting that we had in 76 Portland Place, the Rutherford Centre, Michael Cooper, who wrote this other book shown on the right, actually spoke at that meeting, and that's him standing there on the left. And of course, there's Robert Hooke's own book, published in 1665. Now, I've got rather a poor paperback that you can see there, but it has got all the words in. The pictures are terrible, and I just like to show you, if I can, with a highlighter. There we go. Get the colour. Oh, here we are. Dedication. This is page 3 of a dedication to the King. Designs. I here presume to bring in that which is more proportionable to the smallness of my abilities, to offer some of the less of all visible things, so that mighty King that has established an empire over the best of all invisible things of this world, the minds of men. Your Majesty's most humble and most obedient subject and servant, Robert Hooke. But this book, the real book, is a lot bigger than the copy that I've got, a much larger format than A4. There were, as I say, 3 pages of this dedication. There's 1 page dedicated to the Royal Society. There were 28 pages of preface. Anyway, let me just move on to the next slide. Now, the thing is, we don't know what he looked like, but we know other people who lived at the same time. Isaac Newton, Christopher Wren. Robert Hooke was slightly older than them. And the law that I'm showed on the first slide was actually published secretly. It wasn't, the title was in Latin, and Hooke put the letters of the Latin dedication just in alphabetical order. Now, there was a very good reason that he was keeping it a secret, because he was busy trying to develop a watch. And this is a painting by Rita Greer, who took that photograph in Westminster Abbey. There's a photograph of Robert Hooke presenting a watch by 1775. I mean, he actually made one almost 10 years before, 1646, I think. I think Rita Greer probably took a painting where somebody was presenting, the gardener was presenting Charles II with a pineapple. Anyway, so Hooke Law was published as Tension Sic Vis, or stretching so force. And he used this secret way of publishing it. He needed to keep it a secret because he was afraid that his ideas on a spring and balance wheel to govern a watch was being passed to other people. Anyway, Kate, my wife, thought of a much better clue to what it was: viscose tin suit. Of course, Hooke wouldn't have done. He would have known about tin, but not about viscose. Hooke was interested in springiness. I've shown you a sort of static spring. What he was interested in was the vibrations of the spring, which could be used to control a watch. So he was interested in springiness of all things, including the air. And he built this pump and globe for Robert Boyle to find out about Boyle's law. And he was very specific on how he was doing this, the two of them, observing, hypothesizing as how a gas would behave under pressure, testing, this is the testing, have a theory. And anyway, here they are in a laboratory in Mr. Cross's apothecary shop, as visualized by Rita Greer. And the year is about 1659. They were doing those experiments in Oxford. They were also doing them in London because at the time, Robert Hooke was lodging with Robert Boyle's sister in Pall Mall. And here's Robert Boyle. So we know what he looks like, thanks to this portrait by Johann Kerisboom. But what about Robert Hooke? If you look on the internet, you can see a number of strange representations. But there are some real written descriptions, which you can find in the various books that I've mentioned. Middling stature, something crooked, pale-faced, head large, eye full and popping. He has a head of hair, brown and of modest curl. And another description by somebody who knew Hooke when he was much older. He talked about him being pale, thin skin and bone, eyes grey with a sharp look, forehead large. He went stooping and very fast. And he probably had to be very fast, living in Pall Mall and working at Gresham College, where he became in charge of all the experiments they do there. Because, find my note here. If you look on, use Google and find out how far it is from Pall Mall to where Gresham College was, which is now where Tower 42 or NatWest Tower is, between Broad Street and Bishopsgate. It's 2.7 miles, and that would take 55 minutes today. We don't know what the streets were like then, and I'm pretty sure he couldn't afford a carriage unless he was carrying some equipment or other, when he would have to. He'd be walking. So I quite believe he went stooping, and we'll find out why he was stooping, but very fast. That's the important thing. Now, in my first searches, I very naively thought, I could just go along to the Royal Society and ask them if they've got a picture of Robert Hooke, because I couldn't find one in the first book I looked in. There's the present home of the Royal Society in Carlton House Terrace. I walked into the library, and the library immediately said, there isn't one, there's no portrait. So the story goes that when he died in 1703, Isaac Newton became the president, and he didn't like Hooke. And the story goes he had the picture, the portrait that was portrait. If there was a portrait, he had it destroyed. But I think it's much more likely that in those days, when the Royal Society was trying to find premises, it was moving around. In 1711, it actually moved to 2 houses in Crane Street or Fleet Street. And soon afterwards, the Society ran into financial difficulties. And by 1740, it had a debt of £240, largely because some of the fellows had not paid their dues. Right, so the search goes on. And in 2003, the Daily Telegraph published an article by Alan Chapman. And this is a drawing that his wife, Rachel Chapman, drew, just using those written descriptions. Well, I don't know how likely you think that might be, but he looks a bit of a ruffian, doesn't he? Now we'll go to Lisa Jardine's book. And in there, she has this portrait. It's since been shown that although it was labelled John Ray, it wasn't even John Ray. She thought it might be Robert Hooke. And it was appropriate that Robert Hooke should have his portrait painted about the time that he got the commission to be the architect for the Bethlehem Hospital, which we call Bedmans in Bedlam in Moorfields. It was appropriate in about 1674 that he would have his portrait painted. Anyway, this portrait by Mary Beale, labelled John Ray, that was wrong, but it's now believed to be a chap called John Baptiste van Helmont, a Flemish chemist. Just of interest, he invented the word gas. Now, very recently, only this August, appeared on the internet, portrait of a mathematician by the same lady, Mary Beale. And as an American whose name was Larry Griffin. He's a biologist at the University of Texas. Came up with this portrait and claims it fits the written description. Well, I don't know about you, he looks a bit too plump to me. I don't believe that's right. Now, there was a representation of Hooke in the stained glass windows of this church, which is what was his church in Bishopsgate. And this church is still there. But unfortunately, in 1992 and 1993, with the IRA bombing, the windows got smashed. Not only that, years before that, in 1892, for some reason, they dug up the floor of the church. It was a horrible stink. And they decided to move all the remains of all the bodies where Hooke was buried there. They shifted them all out to a common grave in the City of London Cemetery at Wanstead. So not only do we not know for sure what he looked like, we don't know for certain where his remains are. He's just among a whole lot of bodies. So we go back to trying to visualize now. Our favorite artist, Rita Greer, did this drawing of Robert Hooke in 2006, using those same written descriptions. It looks a bit more friendly in this one, I think. And here that's Rita Greer on the right. She's the artist. And I took this picture at a Gresham College meeting, and in 2008. That's Robin Wilson standing on the left. He's dressed up as Henry Briggs of Logarithms, Logs to the Base 10 fame. It was after a talk that he gave that this portrait was unveiled for Gresham College. And that's Gresham College, which was Thomas Gresham's house originally. He died, and with the money he left to endow 7 professors. And actually Hooke became Gresham Professor of Geometry, and I think his rooms were over here where these doors are. I don't know if you can see this faint green pointer thing. Let's move to the next slide. Now, we're coming back to our meeting in 2012 at 76 Portland Place in the Rutherford Centre. Here's our artist, Rita Greer. I think she's just covered up her new portrait for us at the IOP. And here we are about to unveil it, or at least Sir Arnold Wolfendale's about to unveil it. And there it is, done. And here's the assembled company. I have to tell you that, unfortunately, Sir Arnold died in December this year, aged 93. He's been a great friend to REMS, and he came and spoke to us when we had moved out of Portland Place, and we had a meeting in Imperial College. So on the left we have These were all speakers at that meeting. Rebecca Higgett on the left, Felicity Henderson, Sir Arnold Wolfendale, who was the 14th Astronomer Royal, Rita Greer and her husband, Alan Chapman, the husband of the lady Rachel Chapman, who did that first drawing I showed you, and Michael Cooper, who wrote the book that is largely about the architecture of Hooke, but there's quite a bit about the science as well. Just a little thing I want to add, that Rebecca on the left is on the panel of the people who say who should have blue plaques around in London. And well, we'd like one for Robert Hooke, wouldn't we? But we find that it would have to be on the doorway of, or over the doorway of Tower 42, I think, to be where he lived and worked most of his life. So, and there's the actual picture. This is our picture, unveiled that day 9 years ago. I asked recently, and Paul Hardacre got one of his people, I've forgotten her name, Charlotte Gregory, and she has assured us that it is quite safe. It's in storage at 37 Caledonian Road. So there he is, Robert Hooke, with his spring and his book. But I think the Micrographia is a bigger book than that. Now, what did Robert Hooke do? These were his paid jobs. We'll find out how he started off in life later, but there we are. He was assistant to Robert Boyle, and he was doing lots of things with Robert Boyle, not just Boyle's law, but he was investigating barometers and all sorts of things, and doing some astronomy. He was Curator of Experiments for the Royal Society in 1662, when he was paid about £30 a year, but wasn't actually paid. His salary was up to £50 a year later on, but he was actually he was elected Professor of Geometry at £80 a year, but he's been paid also by Sir John Cutler to do some lectures on the history of trades, whatever the history of trades are. To tell you that Robert Hooke got rather fed up with these, and he started to use the time, which was just before the meetings at the Royal Society, to expand on his own scientific theories. That's another story. He became secretary of the Royal Society in either 16, it might have been 70, might have been in 1679, and that was only because the previous secretary had died. Now he actually got the sack from that job in 1683 for not keeping up the records. Yeah, I've forgotten now. I know they came up for sale, and they're worth a lot of money. The notes, he had all the notes for these things, we just didn't actually write them up officially. Right, the Royal Society was founded in 1660, and Hooke was actually elected FRS in 1663. And anyway, here in his rooms in Gresham College, another little painting by Rita Greer. Rita Greer gave me an envelope full of postcards. I'm just actually using these postcards to make these slides. So I'm very grateful to those. Now, he's interested in all sorts of things, as you might gather, as well as microscopy. He's For instance, he established thermometric zero at freezing point of water, investigated refraction, and he deduced the wave theory of light. He described interference colors for examples in insect wings, those things that we now call Newton's rings. In chemistry, he worked out a theory of combustion. He was quite right about what heat is, before others introduced all that nonsense of phlogiston and caloric. And of course, that wasn't proved until Joule and Kelvin showed that heat's a form of energy in 1850. Astronomy, he observed the rotations of Mars and of Jupiter. He discovered the great red spot on Jupiter. He was the first person to observe stars in daylight using a zenith telescope. I'll come to that later when we talk about the monument. Meteorology, he improved the barometer, the anemometer, the hygrometer. He actually made a recording meteorological instrument. Engineering, he built the air pumps to assist Robert Boyle. And by the way, those pumps were a magnificent thing because there were only, even 10 years later, by 1670, there were still only 7 pumps in Europe, and 3 of those were made by Robert Boyle's workshops. Biology, he drew all sorts of bugs and things in with his microscope. Let's move on. He experimented on himself with drugs and so on. I think he was very worried about his health, but he didn't do himself any good. Anyway, thank goodness the blood transfusion didn't work. I'm sure that would have finished him off. Now, coming up to microscopy, because the exponent at the time was Van Leeuwenhoek, and there's a portrait by him. Oh dear, it says, I may be experiencing network connection difficulties, but I hope you can hear me. You know, I can't hear or see you, so.
Yeah, we can hear you, Mike. We can hear you.
Oh, good, good. I'll just get rid of that. Oh dear, what have I done to myself? I think I'm back normal now. Right, there's a portrait of Van Leeuwenhoek. And actually REMS, we went with David Pick's REMS visit to Den Haag in August 2015, and some of us took a trip down to Delft to go into the church there where we found this memorial to Leeuwenhoek on the wall. Find the next slide.
Mike, at the moment I can't see you. I'm not sure whether anybody else can. Amy, are you there? Can you see anything?
No, I can't see any slides there from Mike.
No.
It says no one sharing. Stopped. No one sees my screen. Oh dear, how do I do that? Is it this thing?
Yeah, we can see it again now. Yeah.
Oh, good. I've got my webcam. Can you see the screen still?
Yeah, and we can hear you as well. Yeah.
Oh, good, good, good. Right. So we've been to Delft, and let's try and move on. I can't move my slides. That's gone backwards. Why can't I go forwards?
You can use the right and left cursor buttons on your keyboard to go backwards and forwards. Okay, yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's useful to know. Anyway, there's his microscope. I've got something obscuring on mine, but the lens, there's a single lens, is right up here. There's a thing that looks like an eye, and the observer is looking at this eel. Examining for circulation in an eel's tail. Yeah, let's just try my. Oh yeah. Oh, I didn't realise that. Thanks, Hugh. I've got an eyepiece at home, and I know how difficult that is to use. You have to hold it very close to your eye, and whatever you're looking at, you have to hold very close to the other side of the lens. So it's incredibly difficult to use, and you wouldn't be able to do drawings like Hooke did because your hands would not be free. So what Hooke did was make a compound microscope, 2 lenses, eyepiece and objective, and then he had a working distance at both ends, and he had hands free. He could introduce light using a condenser lens, as you can see in that picture there, to illuminate the sample. And do wonderful drawings like this stinging nettle. You can see that he made use of the paper or the printing plate, a copper printing plate, because he had all sorts of other figures on the same thing. And the one thing that doesn't is the flea. Hugh told me before he's seen I think Jim Al-Khalili had a TV program which I missed earlier this week, which the picture of the flea is as big as a cat. Anyway, I hope you've got a big screen at home and you can appreciate this wonderful drawing that he did. Now, what rather important thing that he did do was take cross sections and longitudinal sections of a piece of cork. And I just want to read this because it just shows his method. Being a scientist, he wrote up the method. I took a good clear piece of cork, with a penknife sharpened as keen as a razor. I cut a piece of it off, and thereby left the surface of it exceeding smooth. Then examining it very diligently with a microscope, methought I could perceive it to appear a little porous. But I could not so plainly distinguish them to be sure that they were pores, much less what figure they were of. But judging from the lightness and the yielding quality of the cork, that certainly the texture could not be so curious, but that possibly, if I could use some further diligence, I might find it discernible with a microscope. I, with the same sharp penknife, cut off from the former smooth surface an exceeding thin piece of it, and placing it on a black object plate, because it was self a white body, and casting the light on it with a deep plano-convex glass, in other words, that condenser lens, I could plainly perceive it to be all perforated and porous, much like a honeycomb. But the pores of it were not regular, yet it was not unlike a honeycomb in these particulars. And he goes on to say, for the interstitial or walls or partitions of those pores were near as thin in proportion to the pores as those thin films of wax in a honeycomb, which enclose and constitute the sexangular cells are to theirs. Cells, that's the word. He introduced the word cells. Let's move on. Not only did he say what the shape the cells were, he actually measured them and talked about them, the number in a cubic inch. So he was doing measurements. It's all part of the scientific method that he was following. And not only that, he wondered about how a plant can survive. The atoms are too big to enter this. He's talking about fluids, a fluid moving through a plant. So you could see those vegetables discovered to grow on the backside of a rose leaf that I shall, anyway. Talking about the less in bulk than in several trees I have therefore grown in England, and these days flourishing in hotter climates. So he was doing his biology, finding out how a plant worked. Now, come on to a subject. I hope I've got time to include this. One of the particular interests of mine, colour. Of course, we had stained glass windows, and here's light coming through stained glass windows onto a Persian carpet. You may not have seen that, but I'm sure in his church there were stained glass windows. Now, he went so far as to make 2 triangular tanks, one with a yellow liquid in, and the other one with a bluey or cyan coloured tank. And he, by looking through these 2 triangular tanks, he could adjust the amount of each and form a green, much like this. So he made a blue and a yellow wedge, and where they overlapped was green, and he could vary those. My thinking is, if only he'd had a 3rd tank with a magenta liquid in it, he would have then realized about our trichromatic vision, for instance. You produce blues and reds, all the colors. Unfortunately, he didn't. But if he had, he could have done a full color picture out of cyan, magenta, and yellow, and if you register it, make a proper picture. He got so close. Of course, he worked on gravity. Everybody was interested in gravity. It's what they talked about in the coffee shops. It's what they talked about in the Royal Society, Gresham College. And he was actually asked to investigate a finding that somebody had found in a mine up in Halifax, that when this person dangled a weight on a balance down a mine, several tens of feet, that it weighed less. The weight at the bottom weighed less. Well, Hooke did his experiments in Westminster Abbey and in St. Paul's, the old St. Paul's Cathedral, with a nice high roof. And he used a height of 71 feet in Westminster Abbey. He reported to the Royal Society on Christmas Eve. This is 1662. He could not find any change. He thought of all sorts of differences that might have affected the difference in results, condensation on the weights, air currents, difference in buoyancy of the weights. He was quite right to find no difference because he was only looking at 71 feet in 4,000 miles. Anyway, he was looking for a change that was far too small to detect. But he did recognize the importance of a nil result. Don't claim anything unless you're really sure. Didn't stop him thinking about, what might happen. He thought a lot about gravity, and he realized that the planets he could see were all round and so must be shaped by a central force. He worked out that the atmosphere had a high finite height, and so the moons and planets could not have been deflected from a straight path by air resistance. He made many demonstrations using a conical pendulum to simulate the forces involved. And having just been elected secretary of the Royal Society, he now had to do a sort of official things. And he wrote a polite letter to Newton in 1679 to try and bring him closer, because he was working in Cambridge, to the Royal Society, to ask his opinion on his hypothesis that the planetary motion is a result of compounding a tangential motion with an attractive central force. It's possible he was hoping that Newton would use the idea and contribute to the search for the several degrees of attraction to the center, and so reduce all celestial motions to a certain rule. And in his reply, Newton proposed a test to demonstrate the Earth rotates from west to east about its axis by dropping a heavy weight from the top of the tower and noting where it landed. He speculated that if a heavy weight should continue falling and pass through the center of the Earth unhindered, it would follow a spiral path and end at the Earth's center. That's Newton 1 on this diagram. Hooke said, "Oh, no, it should be an elliptoid," and so he did his drawing, and that forced Newton to do the job properly, and produce ellipses. But he had a calculated construction. As you can see, it looks calculated, but he sort of disguised it. But he had forced Newton to think properly about the problem. Right, well, all these people were talking about things in the coffee shop, and there's another little painting by Rita Greer, and we think Hooke might be this person here, hidden behind a waitress holding his quill up in the air. You can see Robert Hooke's interests, conversation, philosophy, languages. He could translate from Chinese, apparently, surveying, negotiating, architecture, geology, science. I'll come on to some of these things. I've mentioned some of those already. So let's move on to architecture. He became an assistant to Wren after the Great Fire. And here they are planning the new city. And here we think this is Hooke's plan. It's in a Dutch book, as you can see, but people have thought about this and I think it must have been drawn by Robert Hooke. And not only was he an architect, he was a great expert on the materials used. There's a material called Ketton stone. It's in Rutland and mined in Ketton, in Rutland. And Hooke did this drawing with his microscope, showing the porosity of it. So he found you could blow through it. You had a thin piece of this stone. He found he could blow through it. There's an optical micrograph of a similar scene, and here's a scanning microscope. Look how similar that is to Hooke's drawing. I find that absolutely amazing. Where did all this knowledge come from? Well, he was born in freshwater. Modern birthing methods. And my wife said, oh no, that's seawater. Anyway, here he is in Freshwater Bay. Freshwater's a village on the Isle of Wight. And by walking around on the island, he learned a lot of things. He didn't have very much in the way of schooling because he was born very weakly, and he lived on a diet of milky foods and fruit. But when he reached 7, his father realized he was going to survive and he would have to earn a living, probably in the church. But he wasn't strong enough to go away to school. So his father taught him, his father was a vicar, taught him English grammar, but that ended when Robert got headaches and his father's health deteriorated. He was left to his own devices. His 5-year-old brother, 5-year older brother, John, who's 12, I suppose, was an apprentice to a grocer in Newport. Eventually ran a butcher's shop and became mayor of Newport. He had 2 older sisters. They were either helping at home or in service. Now, the Civil War began in 1642 when Robert was 7, and soon the Royalist Isle of Wight was run by Parliament. The vicar, his father, lost his living. There was no money for dowries, and so the sisters may not have married. Times were hard, but this is in the country, so that at least there was food. Anyway, he built this fully rigged boat fitted with a device to fire its guns as it sailed across Freshwater Harbour. Yeah, he learned a lot of his mechanics. He watched somebody dismantle a brass clock and he made his own clock out of wood and it worked. He learnt painting, miniature painting called limning, and drawing. Of course, that became very useful for micrographia. He observed glass blowing, grinding and polishing, which he would need to do with his lenses. There's just a picture of a bit of limning. And he saw dyeing, using alum from Alum Bay, that's on the Isle of Wight, salt from Yarmouth, also on the Isle of Wight. Standing on cliff tops, he observed all about navigation and communication, which he could see how useful it was to be able to spot shoals of fish from high up. He found fossils, and he began to think of evolution because he could see similarity between fossils and things that were around now, not just fossils. And of course, he understood the need for measuring instruments. Well, his father died and left him £40, which is not an inconsiderable sum. He also had £10 from his grandmother, so he was a 13-year-old orphan, far from poor. Well, his mother was still alive, actually, but he had no income and needed to earn a living. His father's friends thought he ought to take an apprenticeship in London, and he went to work for Peter Lilly in studio in Covent Garden. He'd been spotted as a possible artist by somebody visiting the island earlier on. And he joined the other artists in filling in the backgrounds and to the portraits and painting in sitters' hands and objecting the pictures. Lily liked him well enough, but Robert couldn't stand the smell of the oil paint, so he left. He went to school at Westminster School, and here he is depicted with the headmaster, Dr. Richard Busby. He's holding a pet linnet, apparently. In this picture, I don't know anything about that, actually. Anyway, that's Westminster School, just near Westminster Abbey. There, he learned music, mathematics, Hebrew, Latin, Arabic, Greek, and some of his fellow students were John Locke, Christopher Wren, John Dryden. Said that he was no better than most at Latin and Greek, but he excelled in mathematics, mastered the first 6 books of Euclid in a week, and learned to play the organ after only 20 lessons. So there we are. He got intrigued by John Wilkins's book and Francis Bacon's ideas, which we've seen he's already put into action using the scientific method. Now we move to Gresham College, and I don't know how true this is, but the telescopes at the time, the normal telescopes, were usually like this. You have a mast, and you have a telescope with a lens at each end of a boom, and you hoist it up and point it at the sky and at any angle you like. But what he was interested in was zenith telescope. And there's actually an engraving in Michael Cooper's book showing Hooke's 36-foot zenith telescope poking through the roof above his lodgings in Gresham College, where that lighted bit is down here. Those are his rooms. He poked a telescope up here through 2 floors and the roof. He was aiming to show that the Earth moved around the sun by observing the parallax, or apparent shift of the nearest star against the pattern of more distant stars. But that angle was too small to measure. We'll come on to a bit more of that when we get to the monument. And here we are at the monument. There's my certificate to show that I climbed it in April. I think I signed it myself, but I got the year wrong and had to change it, as you can see. It's 202 feet high, and Hooke hoped to make that into a 202-foot telescope, at which he might magnify this parallax. But unfortunately, it didn't work because the wooden mounts that held the lenses at the top and bottom of the long tube were just they flexed with heat and wind. Anyway, the parallax he was trying to detect was not actually done until Friedrich Bessel did it in 1838, over 100 years later. He also planned to use the 311 steps, which are exactly 6 inches high, to investigate the effect of different heights on atmospheric pressure. But those experiments had to be discontinued because of the constant vibration of traffic. Amazing. Here, those are my feet there. Now we do have a plaque to Robert Hooke. There it is, set in the floor, very close to the monument. And there's a list of all the things that he did, including being England's Leonardo, so it says on there. That's written around the edge of the plaque. I'll just type them out so you can read them. And there's the top of the monument. To take the flaming thing off the top in order to see the sky. And here's a portrait of Robert Hooke in the Science Museum at the Open Science Building at the Open University in Milton Keynes. Not that he would have given that as his address at the time. Actually, I'm talking about now a church. He got on so well with his old headmaster, Dr. Busby, that when Busby asked him to design and build him a church, he did. And this is Robert Hooke's church that he designed and had built at Willen, near Milton Keynes. And there it is inside. Now, in 2008, REMS we went with a party around St. Paul's, and we were shown this plaque on the right, Robert Hooke. And there it is, right next door to his friend Christopher Wren, who of course was the main architect of the cathedral, so St. Paul's Cathedral. So there we are. Fittingly, he has a proper memorial in that church. So I'll just move to the last slide, which you've already seen. He had original ideas ahead of his time. He did not pirate them, but he made enemies. But at least he goaded Newton into writing up his Principia Mathematica and explaining gravity. He didn't have the rigor, perhaps, of Newton. Perhaps he didn't define his terms well enough to progress in the mathematical way that Newton did. He talked about the force of falling bodies rather than acceleration, as well as the force of impact. He described equations in words rather than symbols, so it wasn't clear enough. But remember, he lived in tumultuous times. Execution of the king, Dr. Busby kept the boys in school that day. Then we had Cromwell and the Commonwealth, the restoration of Charles II, because Charles II was interested in knickknacks and instruments and devices, so they would have, I presume they did meet, they did get on well. Then there was the plague, 1665. He suffered travel restrictions when trying to get back to see his family on the Isle of Wight. His mother died in June 1665. Then there was a Great Fire and rebuilding London. James II, the religious problems, but eventually William III and the Glorious Revolution happened. So he achieved a lot in strange times. He died childless. He had no students who would follow where he had led and developed his ideas in practice, nor anyone to defend his reputation after his death. His character and achievements were either forgotten through misfortune or denigrated. Gregarious, generous, inventive genius who did more than anyone to rebuild London got forgotten. For 300 years, he's generally been thought of as misanthropic, reclusive and bitter, envious of the achievements of greater men. However, he did things like, When he was 29, he reported the account of a lightning strike in Piccadilly. He was living in Pall Mall at the time. And he went over there and he interviewed all the witnesses, and he reported to the Royal Society what he'd seen, and even that there was an old man who'd got an injured mouth, was bleeding from the mouth and was unable to speak at the time. But Hooke went round to see him the next day and was relieved to find that this chap had recovered his speech. So he'd taken the trouble to seek out one of his witnesses and speak to him again. Hooke was voted FRS at the meeting in Gresham College on the 15th of February 1665, in which he continued to work. He burned charcoal with and without air, with the addition of niter, potassium nitrate. And Samuel Pepys was there to watch with the leading members in the Crown Tavern afterwards. Pepys wrote that Hooke is the most and promises the least of any man I ever saw. Pepys easily saw through Hooke's unprepossessing appearance to the nature of the man behind the facade. Many others may not have been so acute. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mike. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. If anybody would like to ask questions, there's a question button that you can press and send in your questions by text. In the meantime, while we're waiting for any further questions, can I ask a question, Mike?
Certainly. Yeah, I was trying to end my thing. End show. Right. I'll discard that.
So
be nice if I could see it.
You've got to probably end sharing your screen, I think.
Yes. There's sharing. Let's just. There I can see you at least.
Okay. I can't see you yet. I can still see your screen.
Oh dear.
I can see you now. Yes, I can see you now.
We can see each other. I'll leave the screen there then.
Yes,
might be useful. What's your question then?
Well, he was obviously such a polymath. He had interest in such an incredible range of different things. How do we know all of this about him? Is there a biography somewhere that somebody's written that? And was it all documented at the time?
I think so. Waller, I've forgotten his surname, one of the people who wrote one of those descriptions, did do a biography, I think, because he survived. I don't know how long he lived, but he did write up something about Hooke, and I imagine that's where people have got their information from. Right. I haven't gone into references and so on, but yeah, I mean there's been quite a few books about him. Besides the 4 that I've mentioned. I think I've mentioned 4, yes. I mentioned Michael Graffer is one of them. That doesn't count. Yeah, yes. People have endeavored to find something about him. There was a lot of effort in 2003 at the Tercentenary. There was a Royal Society symposium, I think, about it, and I even went along to the National Portrait Gallery because they'd had a competition to try and do a painting or an impression of what he looked like. And I remember there were 7 items shown. There was a modern art thing, there was a proper portrait, there was a puppet dressed up to look like him, but I remember that had no face, but that didn't help at all. And these items were all moved up onto a shelf in the entrance hall in the Royal Society. They're all quite high up, so I remember seeing them, but I didn't try and take a picture of them because I wouldn't have learnt very much. So there was a big effort at the Tercentenary to find out about him, and the books that I've mentioned, I think, were all written soon after that.
But was there any contemporaneous biography written of him at all?
Oh, well, I know the references of 100 years before that, people had written about him. Yeah, I'm afraid I'd need to do a bit of research on that.
Right. And there is papers at the Royal Society?
His papers.
Well, did he leave anything as secretary?
Right. I should have mentioned that Lisa Jardine investigated this and found this bundle of papers that Hooke could have used to write up those minutes that he was sacked for not producing. And they were auctioned, just his notes sold for £1 million.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So I don't know who's bought them, some American university, I expect.
Right. And tell us a bit more about his antagonism with Isaac Newton. The two of them didn't seem to get on at all, did they?
It's very unfortunate. Hooke, I think Hooke was always trying to claim priority in some way or another. You know, he liked to think it was his idea, how the gravity worked. But he couldn't work out there was an inverse square law, for instance. That's what I was getting at when I was looking for the various degrees of, I've forgotten how he put it now, but that's how he put it to Newton. And because it took more than Hooke to persuade Newton to write it up properly.
Yes.
I don't know how, they must have met, I suppose, but you know, most of this seems to be done by writing.
Yes.
Because I mean, Newton got elected a FRS for his reflecting telescope. Well, Hooke was also, he worked on the other sort of telescope where you have a hole in the main mirror. Not a Cassegrain, a Gregorian telescope.
Right.
Yeah, Gregorian telescope. You had any questions on the chat at all?
No, I can't see any. Amy, can you see any?
One moment. There's just the one question from Douglas Blundell, asking, Hooke was a good mathematician, and I think he said he looked at the wave theory of light. Did he have the use of calculus, or was that developed by Newton and Leibniz later?
Well, yeah, Newton invented the calculus and had to defend himself against Leibniz quite fiercely. No, even Newton disguised the fact that he invented the calculus by doing his astronomical constructions using geometry. But in fact, he'd actually worked it out using calculus. No, Hooke did not invent the calculus at all. No, he was really an artist. As a lot of great scientists, I reckon, are artists. Like Einstein, he was an artist. He had to get a mathematician to do the donkey work. He had friends who could work these things out. But he had the vision. That's the thing. Hooke had the vision, and didn't always convince people like Newton that he knew what he was talking about. And certainly he couldn't prove it in a way that Newton proved things. That's all very unfortunate, really. But he, as Hugh said, he's such a polymath. He had his fingers in every pie. And he wanted to defend his reputation. And it's just unfortunate that he didn't have people to back him up after he died.
We've got a question here from Roger Woodham, and can you say something about Hooke's role as Surveyor of London?
Yes, because he'd done a grand plan for London, and because that money overtook that, people owned various freeholds and so on, and they insisted on marking out their spaces. And Hooke went out in the field, so to speak, the charred field left by the fire, and he negotiated with people, finding their boundaries, marking them. he was assessing the value of them. I had something about that. He had a way, he used a duodecimal system. So he was incredibly busy after the Great Fire of London. He was charging making experiments, the best way and the best materials for making bricks. He reported on the conditions of damaged buildings, the alteration of streets, planning rebuilding, marking out what people owned, sorted out disputes, estimating the costs of reconstruction. And he used this just duodecimal system to calculate the costs. He wrote areas down in square feet and scrap fractions of a square foot. So 0.5 of a square foot meant 5/12 of a square foot. Made compensation easier when using pounds, shillings and pence. So compensation was usually 5 shillings per square foot, which is 5 pence per 1/12 of a square foot. So I think the accountants afterwards trying to assessors, they couldn't get the right answers because they hadn't understood how Hooke had worked it out. Hooke was right and they were wrong. They had to understand his method. Talk about keeping things a bit of a secret. You know, he even had these quick ways of doing calculations in his head. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yes.
It's a pity we can't see people who are asking the question.
No, there's a question here from Anton Edwards. Mike laid some emphasis on having defenders to protect later reputation. Are there modern parallels for this?
Oh dear, I'm sure there probably are. I can't think of one at the moment, but no doubt one will come. Perhaps somebody else in the audience can offer. 49 people here, apparently.
Yeah. Well, while you're thinking about that, there's a question from John Belling. Was it true that Hooke invented the punch card system used in a weather station?
Oh, I think I've investigated that. He certainly had a recording method, and I don't recall the details. Whether he was invented a pen drawing on rolling paper or something, I'm not sure. But it was recording in some way. But I doubt of it. I think the punch card all came from weavers, didn't it? And the American polling system. We won't go into that.
Yeah,
Not today, anyway.
Jacquard was one of the first to use punch cards, wasn't they? Weaving.
That's Jacquard, yeah. Jacquard looms. Yeah, I think that was the first use of punch card.
Yes. William Kirkpatrick says, not a question, but many thanks for your interesting talk. And Roger Woodham thanks you for your answer about the role for Hooke as surveyor. And I think
I could have spent a lot more time than I did. I was conscious of the time, and I think I overran as it was.
No, I think you were more or less spot on, actually, about 5-2. Yeah.
Well, it was intended to be. When I did my first rehearsal, I think I managed to rattle through it in 50 minutes. But then I tried it live, so to speak, the other day, and I got into a real tangle. It went on for an hour and a half.
Right.
So split the difference.
Yes. Well, I think.
I could.
Sorry.
So I could add some sort of spice to life, if you like. You know, he had a housekeeper, and I can't find the end of my notes. Oh, here we are. Got a great sheaf of papers here. Yeah, say yeah. He's talking about his left home. Yeah. Yeah, he did have a sexual relation with his housekeeper, Nell. She later married, but they remained friends. And note here, the following housekeepers were not so congenial: Bridget Taylor, Dole Lord, Bet Orchard, and Mary Robinson. I know he sacked some of them. Perhaps they wouldn't comply. I don't know. And unfortunately, he did actually have. You told me about this, Hugh. He did have an affair with his niece.
Yes, with whom he lived apparently for a while.
Yes, Grace. Yes, daughter of his brother John, the one who became the mayor of Freshwater.
Right.
Yeah, she lodged with him in Gresham, at Gresham College. To start with, she was only 16. He took her around, showed her the sights of London, and bought her jewellery and so on. But unfortunately, she died in 1687, aged 29, after affairs with other people and a pregnancy with younger men. And I think that led to her father's suicide, in fact. So that was all very unfortunate.
Right.
And
he was well renowned as a bad-tempered person, wasn't he? Do you think is there any evidence for that? Is that true, or is that?
Yeah. I think he probably was. He was probably short with people, being so bright and trying to claim priority on various projects and so on. He probably did get short with people, and that would be bad-tempered. Well, and he was, I say, he was ill when he was young, and he did survive. He was 68, I think, when he died. He left a lot of money, actually. He left £10,000.
Really?
At that time. Nowadays, that must be worth a hell of a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Huge amount.
Yeah, amazing.
And who did that go to? Do we know?
That's a good question. It got dispersed by various relatives. Right. Somehow. It got dispersed with, I don't know, fellow professors of Gresham College. Yeah, the money just disappeared.
Yeah, right.
It wasn't like Thomas Gresham, who left this money to found Gresham College. It took 20 years to sort out his will, and they turned his old house into Gresham College, founded the living for 7 Gresham professors. And by the way, those professors, including Hooke, were supposed to be celibate, a bit like the church. But I was hoping somebody asked about, what was the condition of his taking this job. And the other ones were, I think in the mornings they had to do their talks at Gresham. This is being a Gresham professor. They had to do their talks twice in one day. In the morning it was in Latin, in the afternoon it was in English. And I remember I've been to Gresham College talks, and people have introduced themselves by saying, "Oh, you've come to the English version." I'd like to challenge those people to say, "Oh, I'll come to the Latin one next time," please.
Well, that brings us on to another question we just come in from John Higginbottom. Were there many people at that time who spoke several languages? It was,
Oh yes, yeah, among the gentry. Yeah, among the gentry.
Right.
I mean, Robert Boyle was very conversant with things going on in the East. He spoke Arabic, I think, and I say Robert Hooke learnt some Chinese. He translated from Chinese, apparently. Presumably it was technical stuff. If you had drawings of star charts or whatever, he could work out what the words said or what the symbols said. No, I think everybody spoke French and Latin. It wasn't so long ago that, going back to Plantagenet times, it was another 300 years before, none of the gentry spoke English. The king certainly didn't speak English, didn't write English. Yeah, so, but things changed. And so English gradually got spoken. We know that Newton published Principia in Latin first. It was 10 years before it was translated into English.
Mm.
But Hooke was ahead of his time. He wrote Micrographia in English, and it was meant for people to use. People thought it was a marvelous book. You know, Pepys had a copy, and so it was the most wondrous book he'd ever picked up. Even Newton came around to it. By the time he wrote Optics in 1704, he wrote that in English, and that's a wonderful book too. I have picked up a first edition copy of that, and to read his way of writing up an experiment is in 2 lines. It's incredibly succinct, whereas Hooke gave you a very verbose. So I described that method of him making a microscope slide where he uses penknife to cut a thin film. I thought that was interesting, really, because it gave full instructions for the method of how to prepare a sample.
Mm.
So not only was he a great practitioner, he kept proper records of everything. You see the records of his and Boyle's experiments, seeing the pressure at every volume, or the volume at every pressure, and they did go above and below atmospheric pressure. It's incredibly detailed, and you know, working out what was happening, and letting the temperature stabilize and so on. And it was, and the fact that I think Newton used some geometric scale for temperature. Hooke had an arithmetic scale that started at 0 at freezing point of water. So, you know, he was trying to standardize things so people could repeat what he'd done.
Yes.
You know, I don't know what the scale, I don't know what the top end of the scale was. I only know about the freezing point, but it didn't quite come to Celsius or Fahrenheit even.
Well, there's a comment here from Peter Mercer saying Latin was the convenient international language via the church at the time. So I suppose that's...
Oh, of course.
Yes.
Yes, the lingua franca.
Yes.
The lingua latina, anyway.
Yes. And perhaps we've got time for one final question here from John, another one from John Belling. Is there a Hooke museum anywhere?
Oh, gosh. Not that I know of. I suppose every museum's probably got a section about Hooke in it, I would have rather hope. I'm sure if you go to the Science Museum, you can find out quite a lot. But I don't know there's one per se. No, it's a good point.
Mm. I haven't heard of one.
Like his money, it all got dispersed. All his equipment, no doubt, got dispersed as well.
Yes.
Very valuable that would be too. Yeah.
John suggests maybe in freshwater, perhaps on the Isle of Wight, but I don't recall ever seeing one there.
Yeah. Actually, my parents lived on the Isle of Wight for a time at Carisbrook, just for about 18 months. They were waiting for a house to be built on the mainland. And I remember going to freshwater, but I didn't know about Hooke's beginning at the time. You know, I know I've seen Freshwater Town Hall where his brother was the mayor.
Right.
That's a very good question, and I have been to the Isle of Wight since, but even that was I'm not sure when I last went. So my parents moved to the mainland, and of course we didn't go to the Isle of Wight. We took our children to the Isle of Wight. Yes, so my children are now about 50, so around about 40 years ago was the last time I went to the Isle of Wight.
Well, I think we've... MC Black says Hooke Museum in Freshwater, roberthooke.org.uk. So...
there is one.
So there is one, yes.
Thanks, MC.
Yeah.
Right. Somebody's been... Yeah, I'm not in the position to look on my iPhone while I'm trying to answer questions, but other people
indeed
might.
not. Well, I think that looks like the end of the question. So perhaps we'll draw an end to the talk. Can I, on behalf of the rest of the audience, can I thank you very much?
Well, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you for introducing me, and thank you for putting up with any ums and ahs and things that I had. And
Well, I think that's what REMS is all about, isn't it? It's about a friendly chat. Yeah.
Yeah, it's meant to be a social occasion. I tried to make it a little bit like that. Anyway, there we are.
Okay. Well, just before we end, can I just remind everybody about the 5 talks which are coming up for our next at home, which of course will literally be at home, at everybody's home, starting on the 28th of January. I will send out a reminder. And
I've registered.
Yeah, I would look forward to seeing everybody at one or more of those talks then. So once again, thanks very much, Mike. Splendid talk.
My pleasure.
Very interesting.
My pleasure. Sorry I couldn't see everybody, but if you're still there, thanks for attending.
Yeah, well, thanks very much indeed. I can still see there's quite a lot. There's still 40 people there, so yes.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Right, mind how you go on your way home.
Fall out of my chair. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Right. Now, how do I leave?
I think Amy will shut the meeting down.
I will, yes. Thank you, Mike and Hugh.
Thank you.
See you again soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.